No one could have imagined that behind the elegant glass walls of one of Manhattan's most luxurious penthouses, a woman was quietly waiting to die. While the city outside continued to glow with dazzling lights and endless energy, Serafina lay alone in the master bedroom, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed her. A rare and aggressive illness had slowly consumed her strength over the past several months, turning an ambitious, independent businesswoman into someone who could barely lift her head from the pillow. Every breath felt heavier than the last, and every heartbeat reminded her that her survival depended on a single fragile routine. At the exact same hour, every day she had to take a specialized medication developed through an experimental treatment program. The medicine cost a fortune and was unavailable through ordinary hospitals, but without it, the disease would quickly overwhelm her organs and leave her with only hours to live. Missing even one dose could trigger irreversible damage. Her doctors had warned her repeatedly that strict timing was no longer simply part of the treatment, it was the only thing standing between life and death. The cruelest part of Serafina's situation was not the illness itself, but the loneliness that accompanied it. Although she lived in a breathtaking penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, surrounded by expensive furniture, priceless artwork, and every luxury money could buy, the apartment felt colder than any abandoned building. The silence inside those elegant rooms carried no comfort. It magnified every painful breath, every wave of nausea, and every desperate thought racing through her mind. Just a few years earlier, this home had been filled with laughter, dreams, and endless plans for the future. She and her husband had celebrated business milestones together, hosted elegant dinner parties, and talked about growing old under the same roof. Those memories now felt painfully distant. As her health declined, warmth disappeared from the home, replaced by indifference, impatience, and emotional cruelty. The place she once considered a sanctuary had slowly become a prison where every passing day reminded her how completely her life had changed. Few people knew the sacrifices Serafina had made to build the life surrounding her. Before illness forced her away from work, she had been the driving force behind a rapidly growing trading company that had earned an outstanding reputation across New York. Intelligent, disciplined, and remarkably resilient, she had devoted years to creating a successful business while quietly supporting the people she loved. She never sought public recognition or personal glory. Instead, she willingly stepped into the background, allowing her husband to receive much of the praise because she believed marriage meant sharing success rather than competing for it. Even as her health deteriorated, she continued making important business decisions whenever she had enough strength, determined to protect everything they had built together. She believed that loyalty, patience, and unconditional love would always be enough to keep a family united. Tragically, she was about to discover that not everyone measured love by the same standards. Her husband Thaddeus had not always been the man he had become. In the early years of their marriage, he had appeared supportive, hardworking, and deeply devoted to her happiness. When Serafina encouraged him to take on greater responsibility within the company, she genuinely believed she was helping him fulfill his potential. She entrusted him with increasing authority, eventually allowing him to serve as the public face of the business. The promotion transformed his professional reputation almost overnight. Employees admired him, business partners respected him, and the title of Chief Executive Officer gave him a level of influence he had never experienced before. Unfortunately, success changed far more than his career. The humble husband Serafina had once loved gradually disappeared beneath layers of pride, entitlement, and ambition. Instead of appreciating the opportunities she had given him, Thaddeus began acting as though he alone had built the company from the ground up. Power inflated his ego while greed slowly replaced gratitude. By the time Serafina became seriously ill, compassion had completely vanished from his heart. Rather than seeing a wife desperately fighting to survive, he saw an obstacle standing between himself and complete control of her wealth. If Thaddeus's transformation was heartbreaking, the behavior of his family was even more disturbing. Clarice, his mother, had always hidden her greed behind polite smiles and carefully chosen compliments. Whenever Serafina was healthy and successful, Clarice treated her with exaggerated affection, praising her generosity, while quietly enjoying every luxury that came from her daughter-in-law's financial support. Expensive gifts, shopping trips, fine dining, and comfortable living had all become routine because of Serafina's kindness. Yet the moment illness weakened the woman who had supported them for years, Clarice abandoned every trace of gratitude. She began referring to Serafina as a burden, complaining about medical expenses, and suggesting that no family should have to sacrifice its happiness for someone whose future seemed uncertain. Instead of encouraging her son to care for his wife, She constantly whispered that he deserved a better life free from endless hospital visits and emotional responsibility. Her words poisoned whatever conscience Thaddeus still possessed, feeding his growing resentment until cruelty became second nature. Genevieve, Thaddeus's younger sister, proved no different. Spoiled by years of financial comfort she had never earned, she viewed Serafina less as family and more as a convenient source of endless spending money. Designer handbags, luxury vacations, fashionable clothes, and extravagant entertainment had all been funded by the very woman she now mocked behind closed doors. Rather than expressing concern for Serafina's worsening condition, Genevieve complained that her brother had become too distracted by his sick wife and deserved time to enjoy himself. She eagerly joined every conversation criticizing Serafina, reinforcing her mother's belief that the family should stop allowing illness to interfere with their lifestyle. The generosity that had once benefited her meant nothing now that she believed the money would soon belong to her brother. On the evening that changed everything, the atmosphere inside the penthouse felt strangely divided. In the bedroom, Serafina struggled simply to remain awake as intense pain spread throughout her body. Beyond the closed door, laughter echoed from the living room while suitcases rolled across polished hardwood floors. Clarisse excitedly discussed restaurants she wanted to visit in Paris. Genevieve debated which designer boutiques deserved her attention first. And Thaddeus calmly finished packing for what they described as the vacation of a lifetime. Every cheerful conversation felt like another reminder that no one intended to stay behind with the woman whose condition was becoming more critical by the hour. Fighting overwhelming weakness, Serafina reached toward the bedside table and softly called for her husband. Her voice barely carried beyond the room as she reminded him that it was time for her medication. She asked for nothing more than a glass of water and the small bottle of pills resting on the vanity. It should have been the simplest request imaginable. Instead of concern, Thaddeus answered with visible irritation. He walked into the bedroom wearing an expensive tailored suit, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. Crossing his arms, he complained that she seemed to ask for medicine every few minutes and questioned whether the costly treatment was accomplishing anything at all. Before Serafina could respond, Clarisse appeared behind him with an expression filled with contempt. She bluntly informed her daughter-in-law that the family would not cancel a carefully planned European vacation simply because she happened to be sick. If Serafina needed food, she could order delivery. If she required medicine, she could take it herself. Genevieve quickly joined the conversation, insisting that Thaddeus deserved a break after working so hard, and accusing Serafina of relying too heavily on everyone around her. Their voices overlapped as each found new ways to dismiss her suffering. With every cruel sentence, Serafina realized that the people she had loved and supported no longer saw her as a member of the family. To them, she had become an inconvenience, whose disappearance would solve every problem. As departure time approached, Thaddeus revealed the true depth of his betrayal. Without the slightest hesitation, he picked up every bottle containing Serafina's life-saving medication and deliberately dropped them into the trash. Before she could recover from the shock, he calmly collected her phone and laptop, eliminating any chance she had of contacting the outside world. He walked through the apartment, shutting off the electricity, closing the main water supply, changing the digital security code and locking every possible exit before returning to the bedroom one final time. Leaning close enough for only Serafina to hear, he quietly explained that her illness was hopeless and that everyone, including himself, would be better off once she was gone. With chilling confidence, he spoke about taking control of the company, the penthouse, and every asset she owned as though her death had already occurred. Moments later, the front door closed behind him. The apartment fell into complete darkness, broken only by the distant sound of luggage wheels disappearing toward the elevator. Lying alone in the freezing silence, Serafina finally understood the horrifying truth. This was never simple neglect. It was a carefully planned attempt to leave her trapped, helpless, and unable to survive until anyone discovered what had happened. The husband she had trusted had not abandoned her by accident. He expected her to die. The family she had supported for years had willingly accepted that outcome in exchange for wealth they believed would soon become theirs. Fear surged through her exhausted body, but it lasted only a moment before giving way to something far stronger. Beneath the pain, beneath the betrayal, and beneath the overwhelming loneliness, a fierce determination began to awaken. They believed she had already lost. They believed they had erased every possibility of survival. But as she stared into the darkness surrounding her, Serafina made a silent promise that would change all of their lives forever. "I will survive." The moment the front door slammed shut behind Thaddeus and his family, the luxurious penthouse transformed into a silent prison. Darkness slowly swallowed every corner of the apartment after the electricity was cut off, while the bitter New York winter crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows, replacing warmth with an unbearable chill. Serafina remained alone on the massive bed, her body trembling uncontrollably as the effects of her illness worsened by the minute. Without water, without medication, and without any way to contact the outside world, she knew exactly what her husband expected to happen. He had carefully removed every possible chance of survival before boarding a flight to Europe, convinced that 74 days would be more than enough time for nature to finish the job he had already begun. Every passing second felt like another step toward death, yet somewhere beneath the overwhelming pain, a stubborn determination refused to disappear. She had sacrificed too much, endured too much, and built too much to let her story end in silence. Drawing upon every remaining ounce of strength, Serafina forced herself to move. The simple act of rolling onto her side sent waves of unbearable pain throughout her body. Her muscles refused to cooperate, and even lifting one arm felt like carrying an impossible weight. Still, she refused to surrender. Inch by inch, she dragged herself toward the edge of the enormous bed. The hardwood floor beneath her felt like solid ice as she slowly lowered herself onto it. Every movement stole another breath from her lungs, but she continued crawling across the room with unwavering determination. Sweat soaked her clothes despite the freezing temperature, and tears blurred her vision as exhaustion threatened to pull her into unconsciousness. Nearly half an hour passed before she finally reached the far side of the bed where years earlier she had hidden something no one else knew existed. Sliding her trembling hand beneath the heavy mattress, she searched blindly through the narrow space until her fingertips brushed against the rough plastic shell of an old prepaid cell phone. When the tiny screen illuminated the darkness with its faint monochrome glow, relief washed over her more powerfully than any medicine ever could. The outdated device had been nothing more than a precaution from another lifetime, a habit formed during her early years in business, when she believed successful people should always prepare for unexpected emergencies. She had never imagined that this forgotten phone would one day become the only reason she might survive. Holding it tightly, she closed her eyes for a brief moment before entering a telephone number she had not dialed in years. Every digit carried memories she had buried, long ago memories of a family she had willingly left behind in pursuit of what she believed was true love. As the phone rang, fragments of her past returned with remarkable clarity. Long before becoming Mrs. Thaddeus, Serafina had lived a life few people could even imagine. She was the only daughter of Sterling and Vivian, founders of one of the largest real estate and investment empires in the United States. Raised among boardrooms, private jets, and billion-dollar negotiations, she had never lacked wealth or opportunity. Yet despite everything her family could provide, she had longed for something money could never purchase: a relationship built entirely on sincerity rather than status. When she fell in love with Thaddeus, she made the difficult decision to walk away from her privileged world. She concealed her identity, distanced herself from her parents, and used only a small portion of her personal trust to quietly establish the trading company that would eventually make her husband famous. She believed that hiding her fortune would allow love to flourish honestly, free from greed and social expectations. Instead, the life she had carefully built became the very reason someone tried to murder her. The ringing stopped after only a few moments. A familiar voice answered from the other side of the line. It was deep, calm, and authoritative, the unmistakable voice of her father. For an instant, Serafina struggled to speak. Years of silence, pride, and separation suddenly disappeared beneath the crushing reality of her situation. Fighting back tears, she whispered only a few words. "Dad, it's me." Silence followed. Then she heard the sound of something crashing to the floor before hurried footsteps echoed in the background. Her father immediately recognized her voice. His calm business demeanor vanished, completely replaced by the desperate concern of a parent who believed he might be hearing his daughter for the final time. Moments later, her mother's frightened voice broke through the background as she begged to speak with her child. Unable to hide the pain any longer, Serafina explained everything. She described the illness, the medication thrown into the trash, the electricity and water being cut off the locked apartment, and the 74-day vacation her husband had chosen over her life. Every sentence grew weaker than the last, yet she forced herself to finish before exhaustion could silence her forever. Sterling wasted no time asking unnecessary questions. Years of leading a global business empire had taught him that decisive action saved lives. The moment the call ended, he mobilized every available resource. His private security division received immediate instructions to force entry into the penthouse. A helicopter remained on standby in case traffic delayed emergency transport, while an elite private ambulance equipped with advanced life support equipment raced toward Manhattan. Medical specialists from the family's preferred hospital were alerted before the rescue team even reached the building. Vivian refused to remain behind. Ignoring every attempt to calm her, she insisted on accompanying her husband, terrified that every passing minute might be the difference between seeing her daughter alive or arriving too late. Back inside the apartment, Serafina struggled to remain conscious. Darkness surrounded her once again after the phone slipped from her weakening hands. The freezing air became increasingly difficult to endure, and the painful pounding in her chest grew stronger with every minute. Just as she felt herself drifting toward unconsciousness, the silence was shattered by a deafening crash. Metal screamed against metal as professional rescue equipment tore through the reinforced entrance. Bright tactical flashlights cut through the darkness, followed by the thunder of heavy boots rushing down the hallway. Within seconds, the bedroom door burst open. The first face Serafina saw was her mother's. Vivian rushed across the room without hesitation, dropping to her knees beside the bed and wrapping her daughter in trembling arms. Tears streamed freely down her face as she repeatedly whispered Serafina's name, unable to believe how frail she had become. Sterling followed only moments later. Although the powerful businessman had built a reputation for unwavering composure, the sight before him shattered every emotional barrier he possessed. He immediately ordered the medical team to begin emergency treatment without delay. Doctors checked Serafina's pulse, administered oxygen, started intravenous fluids, and injected medications designed to stabilize her rapidly failing body. Diagnosed with severe dehydration, hypothermia, and acute shock caused by the deliberate interruption of her treatment, she was carefully transferred onto a stretcher before being rushed into the waiting ambulance. As the vehicle sped through the streets of Manhattan under flashing lights, her parents refused to leave her side even for a single moment. The following days became a slow but extraordinary journey back to life. Inside the intensive care unit of one of New York's most advanced private hospitals, Serafina received every treatment modern medicine could offer. Specialists monitored her around the clock while experimental therapies gradually restored the stability that had nearly been lost forever. Yet the greatest source of healing came not from expensive equipment or breakthrough medication, but from the unconditional love she had tried to leave behind years earlier. Every morning, her mother sat beside her bed, feeding her warm soup, brushing her hair, and reading stories simply to keep her company. Her father quietly rearranged his entire schedule to ensure she never woke up alone. For the first time in years, Serafina understood what true security felt like. No one expected anything from her. No one measured her worth by money or success. They loved her simply because she was their daughter. As her strength gradually returned, so did her clarity of mind. Looking back on everything she had sacrificed, Serafina realized that she had mistaken selflessness for love. She had abandoned the people who truly cared about her in order to protect the pride of someone who never deserved her loyalty. The illness had nearly taken her life, but betrayal had opened her eyes. Lying in the quiet hospital room surrounded by the parents, she once believed she had disappointed. She made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She would never again allow kindness to become weakness, or trust to blind her judgment. The frightened woman who had crawled across a dark bedroom floor searching for a forgotten phone no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and finally ready to reclaim the life that had almost been stolen from her. The days following Serafina's rescue marked the beginning of a transformation far greater than anyone could have imagined. Although her body had narrowly survived the cruelty inflicted upon her, her spirit still carried the scars of betrayal. Inside the exclusive private hospital where she received treatment, every hour became another step away from the helpless woman who had nearly died alone inside her own home. A team of renowned specialists worked tirelessly to restore her health using advanced therapies that had once seemed impossible to access. The medication that had been ripped away from her was administered once again under constant medical supervision, while nutritionists designed personalized recovery plans to rebuild the strength she had lost over months of illness. Physical therapists patiently guided her through exercises that at first seemed painfully simple but gradually became symbols of victory. The first time she stood without assistance, tears filled her eyes, not because of the pain but because she realized she was standing against the future her husband had planned for her. Every additional step represented another defeat for the people who had expected her to disappear forever. As the weeks passed, Serafina slowly reclaimed not only her health but also the confidence that illness had nearly stolen. Her pale complexion gradually returned to a healthy glow, the exhaustion faded from her eyes, and the determined woman who had once built a successful business empire began to reappear. Looking at her reflection one morning, she hardly recognized the fragile patient she had been only a month earlier. The fear had vanished, replaced by calm confidence and unwavering resolve. She no longer saw herself as a victim waiting for justice to arrive. Instead, she understood that justice required preparation, patience, and absolute control. The suffering she had endured would not define the rest of her life. It would become the foundation upon which she rebuilt herself stronger than ever before. Once her doctors confirmed that she was stable enough to handle business matters, Serafina shifted her attention toward uncovering everything that had happened during her hospitalization. Working alongside a trusted financial investigation team appointed by her father, she regained access to every personal and corporate account connected to her name. What appeared on the screen was even more outrageous than she had expected. Transaction after transaction revealed enormous sums spent throughout Europe, while she had been fighting to survive in intensive care. Luxury hotels in Paris, private villas along the Amalfi Coast, Michelin-starred restaurants, designer boutiques, high-end jewelry stores, exclusive wine tastings, and luxury car rentals all appeared in meticulous detail. Every credit card statement told the same story. While doctors struggled to stabilize her heartbeat, Thaddeus and his family had celebrated lavishly using the fortune she had spent years creating. Every unnecessary purchase represented another act of betrayal, each receipt becoming a silent witness against them. Curiosity soon led Serafina beyond financial records and into the world of social media. Together with her investigators, she reviewed the public accounts belonging to Thaddeus, Clarice, and Genevieve. The images were almost impossible to comprehend. Clarice proudly broadcast elegant dinners through live streams, smiling proudly while speaking about enjoying the finest experiences Europe had to offer. Genevieve flooded Instagram with photographs of designer handbags, expensive fashion, luxury shopping districts, and glamorous selfies beneath famous landmarks. Thaddeus appeared beside them wearing expensive suits and luxury watches, smiling confidently as though he had already inherited everything his wife owned. The contrast was devastating. On the exact dates these photographs were taken, Serafina had been lying unconscious in intensive care, surrounded by machines monitoring whether she would survive another night. Every smiling vacation photo corresponded with hospital records documenting emergency procedures, powerful medications, and desperate attempts to keep her alive. The contrast between their celebration and her suffering strengthened her resolve even further. They had unknowingly documented their own downfall. Rather than allowing anger to dictate her actions, Serafina approached every decision with the discipline that had once made her one of the most respected entrepreneurs in the industry. At her request, her father assembled an elite legal team led by attorney Vance, a veteran corporate lawyer with decades of experience handling complex financial litigation. Over the following weeks, the conference room inside the family headquarters became the center of an extensive legal investigation. Every corporate document was reviewed with extraordinary precision. Property deeds confirmed that the Tribeca penthouse had been purchased solely with Serafina's personal trust years before her marriage. Shareholder agreements established that she retained overwhelming ownership of the trading company, despite allowing Thaddeus to act as its public chief executive. Banking records identified every account connected to her fortune, while internal company files revealed that Thaddeus's authority existed only because she had voluntarily granted him a revocable executive proxy. Even the credit cards financing the family's European vacation were merely supplementary cards attached directly to Serafina's primary corporate account. Legally, every privilege Thaddeus enjoyed could disappear with a single signature. Attorney Vance immediately began preparing the necessary documents. Formal resolutions were drafted to terminate Thaddeus as chief executive officer. Corporate filings revoked every executive authorization previously granted to him. Banking specialists prepared instructions to freeze joint accounts and cancel supplementary credit cards the moment Serafina approved the order. Ownership records, financial statements, surveillance evidence, and shareholder documentation were organized into comprehensive legal files capable of surviving any courtroom challenge. Every meeting ended with another piece of her empire safely returned to her control. Unlike the emotional woman who had once believed love required endless sacrifice, Serafina now relied solely upon evidence contracts and the protection of the law. Despite possessing the legal authority to destroy her husband's financial world immediately, Serafina deliberately chose patience. Her father repeatedly offered to freeze every account before the family returned from Europe, but she calmly refused. She understood that premature action would only limit the evidence available against them. Instead, she instructed investigators to continue monitoring every transaction without interruption. Every luxury purchase they made became another documented example of financial abuse. Every extravagant dinner, every expensive handbag, every unnecessary hotel upgrade, and every first-class flight strengthened the case waiting for them back in New York. They believed they were spending the inheritance of a dead woman. In reality, they were carefully building the evidence that would ultimately destroy them. Serafina watched the balance sheets with remarkable composure, allowing their greed to expose itself completely before closing the trap. As the 74th day approached, every element of her plan was nearly complete. Her physicians officially declared her healthy enough to leave the hospital, confirming that the disease had been successfully stabilized through treatment. She returned to the Tribeca penthouse, escorted by an elite private security team personally selected by her father. During her absence, the apartment had been meticulously restored. Damaged systems were repaired. New security technology replaced everything. Thaddeus had tampered with. Hidden surveillance cameras were installed throughout the property, and every room was carefully prepared for the confrontation to come. Bodyguards quietly occupied strategic positions inside the residence, while Attorney Vance finalized the legal documents that would be executed the moment Thaddeus stepped through the front door. Financial institutions stood ready to freeze accounts. Company executives waited for instructions to remove him as CEO, and law enforcement authorities remained prepared should the situation escalate. On the afternoon before the family's scheduled return, Serafina stood alone before the large windows overlooking Manhattan. The city below looked exactly as it had before her nightmare began, yet she herself had changed completely. The frightened woman who had crawled across a freezing bedroom floor searching for a hidden telephone no longer existed. In her place stood a confident leader who had recovered her health, reclaimed her authority, and prepared every legal, financial, and strategic detail with remarkable precision. She no longer desired revenge driven by hatred. What she sought was accountability. She wanted the people who had abandoned her to experience the consequences of every deliberate choice they had made. As the setting sun reflected across the skyline, Serafina calmly took her seat in the elegant living room. Around her stood trusted bodyguards, carefully organized evidence, and the legal team prepared to act. All that remained was to wait for the front door to open and allow the architects of her suffering to walk willingly into the future they had unknowingly created for themselves. 74 days after leaving New York, Thaddeus and his family finally returned from Europe, believing they had secured the future they had always dreamed of. Their black luxury SUV rolled to a stop outside the Tribeca penthouse, its trunk overflowing with expensive luggage, designer shopping bags, and souvenirs collected from Paris, Rome, Milan, and the Amalfi Coast. Throughout the entire journey home, their conversations revolved around the fortune they expected to inherit. Clarice excitedly discussed remodeling the penthouse to better reflect her own taste, while Genevieve proudly talked about purchasing a Porsche and moving into a luxury apartment once the estate had been transferred. Thaddeus listened with complete confidence, assuring them that the legal paperwork would be simple because Serafina had no close relatives to challenge his claim. To him, the woman he had abandoned 74 days earlier was already nothing more than a memory. He imagined opening the apartment door, arranging a funeral, and beginning a brand new life funded by the empire someone else had spent years creating. Their confidence lasted only until they reached the front entrance. Thaddeus casually entered the security code he had programmed before leaving for Europe, expecting the familiar sound of the electronic lock disengaging. Instead, a sharp error tone echoed through the hallway. Frowning, he tried again, convinced he had entered the wrong numbers. The system rejected him a second time. Clarice impatiently urged him to hurry, blaming his mistake on jet lag, while Genevieve laughed that perhaps the batteries had died. Before anyone could continue the conversation, the heavy wooden door slowly swung open from the inside. Everything they believed collapsed in a single instant. The apartment was brightly illuminated, filled with warmth, fresh flowers, and the scent of cedar instead of the darkness and decay they had expected. 4 imposing security professionals stood silently around the spacious living room, their expressions unreadable. At the center of the room, seated gracefully on an elegant velvet sofa, was Serafina. She wore a stunning crimson silk dress that contrasted sharply with the pale, fragile woman they had last seen lying helplessly in bed. Her posture was straight, her eyes calm, and her confidence unmistakable. There was no sign of illness, fear, or weakness. She looked every bit the powerful businesswoman she had once been, as though the nightmare they had carefully orchestrated had never happened. The silence became unbearable. Clarice's handbag slipped from her fingers and landed on the marble floor with a dull thud. Genevieve stumbled backward in disbelief, while Thaddeus remained frozen, unable to comprehend how the woman he had condemned to death could now be sitting before him healthier and stronger than ever. Serafina allowed the silence to linger before speaking. Her voice was soft, controlled, and almost welcoming. "Welcome home," she said with a faint smile. "I hope you enjoyed your vacation." No one answered. Instead, Clarice was the first to recover enough to speak. Pointing an accusing finger toward Serafina, she demanded to know why the security code had been changed and why strangers had been allowed into what she arrogantly called their house. Thaddeus quickly regained his composure and stepped forward, attempting to reclaim the authority he believed still belonged to him. He demanded an explanation for the presence of armed security guards and accused Serafina of disrespecting her husband by inviting unknown men into the penthouse. Genevieve eagerly joined the attack, suggesting that Serafina had exaggerated her illness merely to manipulate the family before secretly recovering and enjoying herself while they were abroad. Serafina never interrupted them. She calmly waited until every accusation had been spoken. Only then did she rise from the sofa and walk toward a large mahogany table positioned beside the windows. Resting upon it was a thick stack of neatly organized binders. Without raising her voice, she picked up the first file and tossed it directly toward Thaddeus. The binder burst open as it struck his chest, scattering hundreds of pages across the polished floor. "Pick them up," she said quietly. Confused, Thaddeus bent down and stared at the documents. Credit card statements, bank records, luxury hotel invoices, designer shopping receipts, restaurant bills, private transportation expenses. Every transaction made during the 74 days in Europe had been carefully documented. Serafina slowly began reading from memory. "On the 15th of last month, you purchased a Rolex in Milan using my corporate account." She turned another page. 3 days later, Genevieve spent over $15,000 on handbags beneath the Eiffel Tower. Another page. "Clarice, your dinner overlooking the Amalfi Coast cost more than the emergency medication doctors used to keep my heart beating that same evening." The room fell silent once again. Then Serafina revealed something even more devastating. She nodded toward one of the bodyguards who activated a large television mounted on the wall. High-definition surveillance footage immediately filled the screen. The recording showed every horrifying moment exactly as it had happened. Thaddeus throwing bottles of life-saving medication into the trash, disconnecting the electricity, closing the water supply, taking away her phone and laptop, changing the security code, locking the apartment before calmly walking away. Nobody could deny what they were watching. The evidence was absolute. Clarice's face turned pale. Genevieve covered her mouth in horror. Even Thaddeus struggled to maintain eye contact with the screen. Serafina continued speaking with remarkable composure. "You believe no one would ever know what happened inside this apartment. You thought I would die before anyone discovered the truth. Instead, you documented your own crimes while proudly spending my money across Europe." One by one, she placed additional files on the table. Medical reports, emergency treatment records, hospital admission documents, corporate ownership certificates, property deeds, shareholder agreements. Every document confirmed the same undeniable reality. The penthouse belonged exclusively to Serafina. The company belonged to Serafina. The fortune belonged to Serafina. Thaddeus possessed nothing except temporary authority she had voluntarily granted him. For the first time since entering the apartment, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. The confidence disappeared instantly. Clarice began trembling uncontrollably before suddenly turning toward her son. "This was your idea," she screamed. "You said she wouldn't survive." Genevieve immediately burst into tears. "I didn't know she would actually die," she cried desperately. "I only went on the trip because everyone else did." Within seconds, the united family that had proudly celebrated together in Europe completely turned against one another. Each desperately searched for someone else to blame. Clarice accused Thaddeus of manipulating her. Genevieve insisted she had merely followed instructions. Thaddeus claimed he had acted under enormous emotional pressure and never intended events to go so far. Watching them betray one another almost seemed pathetic. Moments earlier, they had entered believing themselves to be wealthy heirs. Now they were frightened strangers fighting to save themselves. Clarice suddenly dropped to her knees. Tears streamed down her face as she reached toward Serafina. "My dear daughter," she sobbed. "Please forgive us. We made terrible mistakes. We're still family." Genevieve quickly followed, crying uncontrollably while begging for another chance. Even Thaddeus lowered his head. "I was blinded by greed," he admitted. Please don't destroy our lives. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right." Serafina looked at each of them without anger, only disappointment. "The moment you threw my medication into the trash," she replied calmly, "you destroyed this family yourselves." She turned toward the security team. "Escort them out." The command was carried out immediately. Professional bodyguards moved with disciplined precision, preventing any resistance. Thaddeus struggled as they seized his arms, shouting that he was still the CEO and legal owner of the company. Clarice screamed hysterically, insisting she had every right to remain inside the penthouse. Genevieve desperately gathered expensive shopping bags before security calmly placed every suitcase, handbag, and luxury purchase into the hallway beside them. Standing in the doorway, Serafina delivered the final words they would ever hear inside the home they had hoped to inherit. "This penthouse was purchased with my trust fund long before I married you. You have never owned a single inch of it." The heavy door closed firmly. The electronic locks reset. Their fingerprints were permanently removed from the security system. But Serafina had only begun. The following morning, she personally visited the bank and authorized the immediate freezing of every joint account connected to Thaddeus. Every supplementary credit card issued to him, Clarice, and Genevieve was permanently canceled. Financial institutions transferred her remaining assets into secure accounts under her exclusive control. From there, she proceeded directly to the headquarters of the trading company she had founded years earlier. During an emergency board meeting, Attorney Vance presented official ownership documents, proving Serafina's controlling interest in the corporation. The board unanimously approved resolutions terminating Thaddeus as chief executive officer, revoking every executive privilege he possessed, and removing his authority over company operations effective immediately. Completely unaware of what had happened, Thaddeus confidently arrived at the office, wearing an expensive Italian suit purchased during the European vacation. Security guards stopped him before he reached the elevators. Human Resources handed him a termination letter together with a small cardboard box containing the personal belongings removed from his executive office. At that exact moment, his phone began ringing repeatedly. Genevieve, crying hysterically. Every credit card had been declined. Luxury stores refused payment. Bank accounts displayed frozen balances. There was no money, no company, no authority, no future. Within less than 24 hours, everything they had believed belonged to them disappeared forever. Serafina's final move extended beyond the courtroom and the boardroom. Her legal team released carefully organized evidence across TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and X. The surveillance footage showing the attempted murder was published alongside hospital records, financial statements, and photographs documenting the family's extravagant vacation. Millions of viewers watched the story unfold. Outrage spread across social media at extraordinary speed. News organizations covered every development, while comments condemning Thaddeus and his relatives flooded every platform. The internet quickly transformed them into symbols of greed and betrayal. Employers refused to hire them. Former friends disappeared. Businesses rejected them. Everywhere they went, strangers recognized their faces from the viral videos that exposed the truth. The empire they had dreamed of stealing no longer existed. Neither did the reputation they once enjoyed. By the time the storm finally settled, Serafina had reclaimed far more than her wealth. She had recovered her dignity, restored control over her future, and proved that patience, intelligence, and courage could accomplish what anger alone never could. Meanwhile, the family who had abandoned her in pursuit of easy riches discovered the harshest lesson of all: greed may promise everything, but in the end it leaves nothing behind except ruin. The legal battle that followed quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in New York. What had begun as a private family betrayal had evolved into a shocking story of greed, attempted murder, and financial deception that captured national attention. Every major news outlet reported on the upcoming trial, while social media remained flooded with discussions about the woman who had survived an elaborate plan to steal her fortune. On the morning the proceedings began, the courthouse was surrounded by journalists, photographers, and spectators, hoping to witness the downfall of the man who had sacrificed his wife for money. Serafina arrived quietly with her parents and legal team, dressed in a simple navy suit that reflected dignity rather than revenge. She no longer needed expensive clothing or public attention to prove her strength. The confidence in her eyes spoke far louder than any headline ever could. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Thaddeus sat beside his defense attorneys, looking nothing like the arrogant executive who had once believed the company belonged to him. Weeks of public humiliation and endless investigations had stripped away every trace of confidence he once possessed. Across the room, Clarice and Genevieve watched nervously from the public gallery, their anxious expressions revealing that they already understood how overwhelming the evidence had become. The prosecution wasted no time presenting the facts. Financial experts carefully explained how company funds and personal accounts belonging to Serafina had been used to finance the family's extravagant European vacation. Banking specialists verified every transfer, every luxury purchase, and every unauthorized transaction. Medical professionals testified about Serafina's fragile condition and explained that depriving her of medication would almost certainly have resulted in her death without immediate intervention. The most powerful moment came when the courtroom lights dimmed and the surveillance footage from the penthouse was projected onto the large screen. Complete silence filled the room as the recording showed Thaddeus deliberately throwing away the medication that kept his wife alive. The video continued capturing him, disconnecting the electricity, shutting off the water supply, confiscating her phone and laptop, changing the security code, and locking the apartment before leaving with his family for the airport. Every movement was calm, calculated, and impossible to misinterpret. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom as the horrifying reality unfolded before the judge and jury. Even members of the press lowered their cameras, stunned by the cold precision of his actions. The defense attempted to argue that Thaddeus had acted out of frustration and never expected Serafina to die, but the evidence destroyed every excuse before it could gain credibility. His own words, captured by hidden microphones during the incident, revealed his intention to inherit her company, the penthouse, and every asset she owned. There was no misunderstanding. There was no accident. The truth had finally been exposed in full view of the public. After several days of testimony, the jury needed only a short time to reach its decision. When everyone returned to the courtroom, the tension became almost unbearable. The foreperson stood and announced the verdict clearly and without hesitation. Thaddeus was found guilty of attempted murder, financial fraud, abuse of fiduciary responsibility, and multiple related offenses. The judge described his actions as a calculated betrayal motivated entirely by greed and stated that society could not tolerate crimes committed against those who placed their trust in the people closest to them. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, ordered to pay substantial financial compensation for the physical and emotional harm inflicted upon Serafina, and permanently barred from holding executive positions in any publicly regulated corporation. Every remaining legal claim he had attempted to assert over Serafina's business empire was declared null and void. Court officers immediately placed him in handcuffs and escorted him from the courtroom. As he disappeared through the security doors, the man who had dreamed of becoming a billionaire left with nothing except the consequences of his own choices. Outside the courthouse, the destruction of his family continued. Clarice and Genevieve had already exhausted every remaining source of money during the months leading up to the trial. With their bank accounts frozen, luxury possessions confiscated, and reputations destroyed, they found themselves unable to maintain the extravagant lifestyle they had once taken for granted. Former friends refused to answer their calls, relatives distanced themselves from the scandal, and employers rejected every job application after recognizing their names from the widely publicized case. The expensive clothing and jewelry they had proudly displayed across Europe were eventually sold simply to buy food and temporary shelter. Before long, even those resources disappeared. Reduced to moving between inexpensive shelters and sleeping wherever they could find safety, they experienced a reality completely opposite to the privileged life they had once expected to inherit. The wealth they had pursued so relentlessly had vanished, leaving only loneliness, regret, and the painful memory of opportunities they had destroyed with their own greed. Several weeks after the sentencing, Clarice and Genevieve requested one final meeting with Serafina. Against the advice of her legal team, she agreed, believing every chapter deserved a proper ending. They met in a quiet garden outside the charitable foundation established by her parents. The two women looked almost unrecognizable. Their confidence had disappeared, replaced by exhaustion and deep remorse. As soon as Serafina approached, both fell to their knees. Tears streamed down their faces as they apologized repeatedly for every cruel word, every selfish decision, and every moment they had chosen wealth over compassion. Clarice admitted that her obsession with money had blinded her to basic humanity, while Genevieve confessed that she had spent years envying the very woman who had generously supported her. They begged for another chance, promising to change if only Serafina would forgive them and help them rebuild their lives. Serafina listened patiently until every apology had been spoken. When the silence finally returned, she gently asked them to stand. Her voice remained calm, free from anger or bitterness. "I forgive you," she said quietly. Not because you deserve another opportunity to be part of my life, but because I refuse to carry hatred any longer. Forgiveness gives me peace. Trust, however, cannot be rebuilt after someone deliberately chooses your death. Her words ended every remaining hope they had carried into the meeting. Without raising her voice or showing resentment, Serafina made it clear that compassion did not require reconciliation. Some relationships are broken beyond repair, and protecting one's future sometimes means leaving the past behind forever. In the months that followed, Serafina chose a life far removed from the ambition and betrayal that had nearly destroyed her. She returned to work only after her doctors confirmed she had fully recovered, taking an active role in leading the company she had built from the beginning. Under her guidance, the business expanded while also funding medical research programs and charitable initiatives supporting patients suffering from rare diseases. She spent more time with her parents than she ever had before, rebuilding the family bond she once sacrificed in pursuit of a love that had proven false. Together they traveled, celebrated quiet moments that money could never replace, and discovered a happiness built on trust rather than appearances. Although the memories of her ordeal never completely disappeared, they no longer controlled her heart. She had learned that surviving betrayal was not simply about defeating those who caused the pain. It was about refusing to let that pain define the rest of one's life. Looking out across the Manhattan skyline from the same penthouse where her nightmare had once begun, Serafina smiled with a sense of peace she had never experienced before. The home no longer reminded her of fear. It reminded her of resilience. Everything she had regained, her health, her company, her family, and her independence, had been earned through courage rather than revenge. Her story became a powerful reminder that greed ultimately destroys the very people who embrace it, while integrity, self-respect, and perseverance create a future no betrayal can ever take away. In the end, Serafina's greatest victory was not the fortune she protected or the prison sentence imposed upon the man who betrayed her. It was the life she rebuilt with dignity, proving that even after the darkest betrayal, hope remains possible for those who refuse to surrender.